What's up, you guys? So today I'm going to talk to y'all about tides and how tides affect fish, specifically redfish, red drum. So I grew up bass fishing as a little kid, and then when I started getting into my teens, I really got into saltwater fishing. And to me, that's what makes saltwater fishing so fun and such an interesting experience, is that you have the tides and you have this ever-changing environment. So if you guys can figure out how the tides affect the fish's behavior and how it affects how they feed, then you'll be that much more successful out there on the water. So it's important for you to understand, first and foremost, to really fish with the tides. Again, fish are driven by three things: feeding, comfort, and spawning. High tide, think pockets, think grass flats, think areas where those redfish can not necessarily ambush, but trap their bait. So the redfish are gonna trap their bait up against, grass flats and up against marsh areas. So high tide, that's where you're gonna wanna think. If you come across an area that's almost like a cul-de-sac of a grass flat, then that's an excellent area that you're gonna wanna target those redfish. And that could be a cul-de-sac of a 3 to 4 square mile vicinity of that flat. And so those redfish are gonna be scattered all throughout that massive grass flat, just feeding on all of those exposed bait fish and forage in that high tide. So when that tide starts falling back, then that's where you're going to want to focus, maybe back on those adjacent points to that grass flat or other points that would be similar to that across, because you want to be on the move with these redfish. That's another important thing with these tides, is that these redfish, they're on the move constantly, and the more tidal chains that you have, the more redfish movement that you're going to have. And again, you can use that to your benefit. It actually sounds like that makes it more difficult, but it really doesn't. You can actually use that to your benefit for targeting the redfish. That with those redfish moving more, then that means that you would be that much more susceptible to hooking up to not just one school, but maybe 2 or 3 different schools of redfish, almost in the certain spot that you're fishing or similar areas. So high tide, again, think pockets, think areas that the redfish can trap their bait, the grass flats, the marsh areas. And then low tide, think areas that will concentrate the bait in ambush points. So those are going to be the eddies, the rip lines, points that would be adjacent to that grass flat. That's how you want to kind of process that right there. So with that being said, so tides move bait, and fish are always on the move, especially redfish. Where you have tide and tidal changes, especially up and down on the East Coast, like Virginia, down to Florida, certain parts of the Gulf Coast, then you're gonna have more fish movement. That actually means that the redfish are gonna be that much more predictable. The shrimp, the mullet, and a lot of the forage of the redfish will push up as that tide moves in. They're gonna push into areas such as this. These are grass flats in here, and these are excellent areas, feeding areas for redfish, especially during high tide. So at high tide, what I look for is more like pockets, areas that the drum are gonna be able to trap their forage, whether that's the shrimp, the mullet, any of the fish that they're eating on. At low tide or an outgoing tide, then I focus more on ambush points, and really specifically points that might be adjacent to a flat where those redfish will move up to feed during that high tide. So if you can locate areas such as that, then that will make you that much more successful, in fishing with the tides. Redfish don't necessarily bite better on an incoming or outgoing tide, but understand that tides do move their forage, and when the forage is moving, then the redfish are going to be moving with that. Because redfish are on the move so much, you're going to want to focus on really trying to intercept the schools of redfish, as opposed to trying to keep up with one school of redfish. So what a lot of professional anglers do is they'll focus on an area that holds fish, and maybe they'll catch a few redfish, and they'll pick a few out of the school. And once they land that fish, that school could be hundreds of yards, if not further away. So as opposed to them trying to get back up with that school of fish, which is literally like shooting the wind, then they're gonna pick a spot that's similar to that. and then try and intercept another school of redfish. So just remember that for tides, high tide, those redfish are going to be moving up into those grass flats where the shrimp and the mullet are going to be moving there as well. In extreme high tides, that's actually going to send the redfish into more like a feeding frenzy, and we've expressed that into our channel in some of our tutorials. Those redfish, they're actually going to be feeding on different types of forage, like even like snails. Fiddler crabs are kind of a great example, you know, as that tide kind of rolls in. That's where the redfish are literally going to be picking, and they say those tailing red drums, that those redfish are going to be digging into certain areas like this, looking for that type of forage. With an outgoing tide, I would actually look at an area that perhaps is off of a flat that is a point. And if you have, say, like a gradual point, if it has an oyster bar that runs out gradually adjacent to a flat, that's an excellent area that you're going to want to look at for targeting those outgoing or low tide redfish. If you have a drop off also that's kind of adjacent to that flat, to that feeding area, then that's another area that you would want to look for. So just think low tide, think of areas that will concentrate bait fish. Sometimes you're fishing at dead low tide and you'll see jumping mullet, and you'll see also an outgoing tide is great because it creates excellent ambush points. So where you have like an eddy that's around, say like a grass patch, or it could even be like a bridge column or a dock or some sort of a structure, that's going to be another area too that you would want to target that outgoing tide redfish. So think outgoing tide, ambush points. High tide, you're going to be thinking pockets. And so these are areas that you'll see. So I'm showing you guys some footage right now of some areas that are like pockets where some water is going to be exposed in the grass flats, and that's where the redfish are going to be looking at for feeding during that high tide. Some of our biggest catches of redfish and most catches of redfish is going to be at high tide. But again, you do not want to overthink it, because redfish are opportunistic feeders, and where they see food, where they see bait, they are going to take advantage of it. So if you catch a redfish on, let's say, an outgoing tide at the end of a grass flat, and you take note of exactly when you caught that fish, at what point that tide, take note of that, because that could be a bite that you could duplicate on that same exact tide and that same exact conditions. So what I mean by that is, take note of where you caught that redfish and what tide it was, because those are areas that you want to keep in mind. A lot of guides and pro redfish anglers who have certain areas dialed in, they can literally like mark their watches to a certain time of, yep, that redfish is, you know, going to intercept based on when they've caught their redfish and what tide that it was. Another quick tip for tides, the tides are delayed by 50 minutes each day. Okay, so another quick tidal tip too is that the greater the tidal change, like in areas, you know, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, where you have a pretty significant tidal change, then typically the more predictable that those redfish are going to be. So that's why you don't really want to focus too much on the winds in areas that have a significant tidal change. It's really going to be how those fish are moving with that moving water. Unless you have a wind that's able to push a, you know, 3 to 4 knot moving water, then that's like hurricane status. So you really want to pay attention to the tides, not as much to the wind. Slack tide, absolutely. You know, slack tide doesn't move as much bait, so you don't have as much movement there. Where you have more movement, then you're going to have a little bit more of a feeding action. So the slack tide, you know, my buddy Elias from Elias V Fishing, he caught this 50-inch redfish on the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. He caught it on a dead slack tide. So it's not like a slack tide means don't fish. And it's not like an incoming tide is significantly better than an outgoing tide. You can talk to 10 different redfish anglers and they'll probably tell you 10 different things. So just really keep your confidence up, understand how the tides affect the redfish movement, and then try and come up with a plan where you can strategically plan around that. You know, fishing's not just luck, it's really having a strategy, having patience, and the ability to execute on that plan. So hopefully those are some quick tips for you guys on redfish and how they're affected by the tides and how you guys can create your plan when you're out there on the water. That's all I got. I'm Jeff with One Fish, Two Fish. You guys get up off your butt and go catch yourself some fish. All right, peace out.